And while everyone's still kind of getting settled, just wanted to go through some logistics here. Just make sure that you have your microphone on mute just to avoid any background noise or any dogs barking. I'm guilty of that. So just make sure you have your microphone on mute unless you're talking. And another thing that would be really helpful, if not already, if you can rename yourself to your first and last name, that will really help Courtney in getting us assigned to our breakout rooms. And if you don't know how to do that, if you hover over your face and you click those three dots, there will be an option to rename. If your name isn't already in that format, that would be really helpful. So let's go ahead and get started. I think, Courtney, you think we can get started? Okay.
Sounds great.
Perfect. All right, everyone. So here's all our lovely colleagues that are here that are leading our discussion groups, as well as the lectures today. And just another thanks to our partners who have made this course possible. So here for today's agenda, we're going to be having a discussion over step 3 from last week, some adaptation options and selecting adaptation actions. We'll also have an introduction to step 4, as well as the assignment for next week. So last week we covered step 3, which is evaluating management objectives, considering climate change. So in this step, you brought together your management goals and objectives you identified in step 1 and the climate impacts that you identified in step 2 to think about how climate change will affect your management goals and objectives. So this is the step where we really connect climate change to our current management actions and consider how climate change will make our management objectives more or less difficult to achieve. In this step, you weigh the challenges and opportunities that climate change presents and determine the feasibility of meeting your management objectives under your current management. So in step 3, we ask the following questions. Here we go. What management challenges or opportunities might occur? Can current management meet management goals, or do our goals need to change? So this is where we connect climate change to our current management. How will climate change make our objectives more or less difficult to achieve? And if the objectives do not seem feasible given climate change, can we alter or modify them moving forward? So we also looked at feasibility. So we evaluated feasibility of achieving your objectives given the challenges and opportunities that you have identified using current management. So something to note is that feasibility can be determined for individual or multiple timeframes, so short-term versus long-term. Now, if we have high feasibility, like we discussed last time, where existing management options can be used to overcome the challenges for meeting management objectives under climate change. So this is where our opportunities are likely to outweigh our challenges. Or we could have moderate feasibility, where some challenges to meeting management objectives under climate change have been identified, but these can probably be overcome by using existing management options. So additional or enhanced efforts may be necessary to counteract key challenges or promote new opportunities. Or we could have low feasibility where existing management options may not be sufficient to overcome challenges to meeting management objectives under climate change. So we really want to hear what you guys came up with, and we'll have a chance to do that in our discussion section today. So here we go. All right. Courtney, are you taking over here or Maddie?
I'll take over here. So now what we're going to do, thanks for that introduction, Lauren, and for kicking us off today. I really appreciate it. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take some time to really talk about step 3 and what you've been working on for the last couple of weeks for your projects. And again, talking about those climate change challenges and opportunities and the feasibility of being able to achieve your management objectives into the future. And so we're going to split into breakout groups now. And I think I have everyone assigned to a room. So if I put you in the wrong one, just let your group lead know and we will try to fix that. But we are going to take the next 30 minutes to really have some good breakout group discussions. And so we're going to do the breakout groups from 9:05 now until about 9:35, and then we'll come back together as the larger group again. And so your facilitators have some of those questions to ask. They're also the ones that we sent around in that email yesterday. And so hopefully you've had a chance to start thinking about some of those challenges and opportunities for your projects. And with that, does anyone have any questions before we split up into our breakout groups? Awesome. I am not hearing any. So I am going to open up the rooms and you should be able to join now.
Sorry, I joined in a couple minutes late. How do I know which breakout room to go into?
No problem. I haven't assigned you yet, Edith. That's why. I will slip you into your correct breakout group. And I think you're in group 4. Is that where I put you last time?
I was actually out last class, so we should be with Elliot and Puvawa folks.
Perfect. I will put you there and then.
Oh, I see it now. Thank you.
Awesome. And Kalu, I think you're in group 5, so I will put you there. And then Natalie, let me know if you're having issues joining your breakout group. Let's see, you should be in group 2. So Natalie, are you the phone number?
Yeah, sorry, my audio wasn't working, but it says joining group 2 now.
Perfect. I'll make sure that your audio also gets assigned with the breakout group 2. Awesome. And then Helena, I put you in group 4 again if you want to join that group with me. Thanks. So it sounds like everyone had really great discussions in your breakout groups. And so what we want to do now is just kind of bring some of the themes that we heard from those discussions, but especially thinking about feasibility of meeting your management goals and objectives under climate change over the short term and the long term. So I'm kind of, just ignore what it says on the slide, but I want to do another annotate activity. And what I want you to think of first is how you rated your feasibility over the short term. So say the next 10 to 15 years in that shorter planning horizon. And so if you could use that annotate feature again to please check your feasibility and how you're rating your current management objectives using current management actions and how successful you think they're going to be in the short term. Go ahead and use that annotate feature to mark on the screen if you think it's low, moderate, or high feasibility. Awesome. And again, low feasibility means that those challenges really outweigh the opportunities. Moderate is somewhere in the middle, and the high feasibility is there's a lot of opportunities and they really outweigh some of your management challenges under climate change. And as you're all annotating, would anyone be willing to share kind of some of what you were thinking and why you rated your feasibility as what it looks like either moderate or high over the short term? How about someone who rated their feasibility as high? What are some of those opportunities that are outweighing your management challenges?
I'll go. In terms of climate change impacts in the near term, I don't know if that affects us too much with our ability to do fencing and ungulate removal on the Puawa cone. I think funding is definitely a limiting factor, and staff and resources. But if we can overcome those, then it's an easy place to fence and pretty high feasibility if we can get the funding.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing, Elliot. Would anyone else like to share what they were thinking with your short-term feasibility rating? Okay, so now what we're going to do, Maddie, if you could clear those annotations. What I would like everyone to do now is hopefully you had a chance to discuss what your feasibility is going to look like over the long term. And so after Maddie clears, perfect. Now, if you could please rate your feasibility over the long term. So thinking farther into the future, how are those climate change impacts going to change over the next maybe 25 to 50 or 100 years into the future? And is that changing your feasibility rating? So go ahead and annotate on the screen and mark where you think your feasibility of achieving your management objectives is going to be for that farther planning timeframe, so 25 to 100 years into the future. Awesome. And already I'm seeing, as we think about how those climate change impacts are going to really manifest, I'm seeing less high feasibility. It looks like people are kind of on that line between low and moderate feasibility. And so would anyone be willing to share what you're thinking as far as that longer time frame and how you're rating your feasibility now? Why it might have changed? Or stayed the same if you rated it as moderate for the short term as well.
I'll share. With the Koho'olawe gang, we rated moderate feasibility on both long and short term, acknowledging that funding as well as political factors would affect both, with the long term being more about political factors rather than, and then the short term would be more funding factors than political.
Thanks, Hoku. That's really helpful. Yeah, so this is where those other considerations are really coming into play with the funding and the political factors. And I know with the Puvawa group, we were talking about the capacity to get water to the top of the cone into the future under those drought conditions as well. And there's some different considerations there. So that's great. Anyone else interested in sharing before we move on?
I'll share a little bit. This is Andrea Gill at Gill of Lands. The feasibility didn't really change that much for us. This particular area is hot and dry. It will get hotter and drier. But what I think are constraining factors are things like our knowledge of appropriate soil amendments and so forth, things that we can do to help the success of our outplantings. So I don't think any real management actions are going to change, but just in the short term, we might not have that knowledge. And in the longer term, we will have had a chance to run more experiments and see what works. So I didn't see a whole lot of impact. I think we're among the only private landowners. Everybody else seems to be an agency. So we make our own funding by and large. And I'm not saying we're not constrained, but politics and getting grants is not big in our planning. Well, in some cases it is, but not for this particular project.
Awesome. Thanks, Andy. That's a great example of how you've got a lot of opportunities to learn. And so that will probably increase the options for adaptation and some of your management actions moving forward into the future. So I appreciate that. Thanks for sharing. Great. So now with that, Maddie, would you be willing to clear the annotate? And then what we're going to do now is Maddie is going to start covering step 4 and what we want you to start working on over the next week. So thanks again, everyone, for participating in those breakout group discussions and for sharing those examples with the larger group. We appreciate it.
All right, thanks everybody. Yeah, we had some really great breakout discussions, and it's just great to see how far everybody's come up to this moment. So this week we're moving on to step 4, and this is where we identify climate adaptation actions that are designed to respond to those climate challenges and opportunities we identified in step 3. So in this step, we have a number of what we call adaptation menus that provide strategies, approaches, and examples of adaptation tactics that you can select and modify and get creative with as needed. So step 4 is really about exploring what actions can enhance the ability of the project area to adapt to expected changes. And basically, this is just the time to plan out what you're going to do in response to climate change and really decide how you're going to address your challenges and take advantage of your opportunities. So maybe some of you already came into this course having a notion of what these actions might be, and you kind of affirmed your hunches by going through steps 2 or 3. Or maybe the last few weeks have really set the scene for you to start thinking about these actions for the first time, or prompted you to maybe reevaluate those things you already had in mind. And so NIAX has developed a range of adaptation menus in collaboration with other partners to help guide folks in the process of exploring and developing adaptation actions. So you can find several of these adaptation menus that will be embedded right into the workbook. So while you're working on the Adaptation Workbook website, you'll be able to access them. And then you can find even more through this link at the bottom of the page, which I think one of our facilitators should be able to share in the chat. And so the adaptation menus are basically an organized set of possible actions that you can pick and choose from in order to address specific problems. And so the approaches are, they are organized by specific topics and disciplines. So we have menus for forest ecosystems, agriculture, urban ecosystems, etc. And then for each menu, the adaptation actions are kind of organized in a hierarchy, going from broad to more specific information. And of course, it's important to note that NIAX has been developing these menus over the years, mostly in the context of our original regions of focus in the Midwest and the Northeast. But we have been developing new menus as we've expanded into working with partners across the United States. And so just like at a restaurant, you're going to use these menus to put together your own unique order. But it's also important to remember you're probably not going to order everything on the menu. So these adaptation menus will definitely cover some broad ideas that might be applicable to you, and then maybe some specific things that you're dealing with. But the expectation is also that you're kind of going to do like a build your own style of ordering. So you will be using your own expertise to kind of articulate those specific actions and tactics. So just think of the menus really as repositories of ideas from which you can expand upon and get more creative and specific with. And again, using the adaptation menus is helpful for connecting broad ideas to specific tactics, and it can also help you sort of backstep. So if maybe you have a really specific tactic in mind, but you're like, what kind of broader adaptation concepts does that link to? The menus can help you sort of backstep and understand that bigger picture. And so this might all seem kind of abstract without actually looking at the menus. So let's talk a little bit more about that. Some of the earlier menus are the ones that are already built into the online workbook, and those are the ones you see on the left. But some other newer menus are available on forestadaptation.org, and those focused on even more topics. And so I really want to encourage this group to, in addition to the ones in the adaptation workbook, to check out some of these other menus on the right. especially the tribal perspectives and the coastal ecosystems menus. So the tribal perspectives menu was just launched in 2019, and it was developed by a core group of authors representing a range of different tribes and indigenous groups throughout the Great Lakes region. And so for this menu, the team of collaborators was really in the driver's seat, and they created an amazing menu which is designed to support their specific cultural values and focuses on long practiced traditional uses of the land. And it also does a really beautiful job of incorporating language. So in this case, it features the Ojibwe, Anishinaabeg, and Menominee languages while still being accessible. And so we do also have the coastal ecosystems menu in draft form that might be of interest to some of you. And we shared that in the last course newsletter, and we'll also make sure to share it again with you all tomorrow. So really, you can use whatever menus best suit your needs, and you don't need to limit yourself, but we really want to encourage you to just explore them and maybe kind of focus on the one that's like mostly applicable to your site. And then as part of your homework for this week, we're asking you to watch a short video on these concepts. So I won't go into too much detail here, but I kind of wanted to introduce this spectrum of different adaptation directions, which are resistance, resilience, and transition. So the difference between these concepts is essentially their relationship with change. So the change is either being resisted, accommodated, or promoted. And so in the resistance approach, we're trying to kind of defend our systems from large-scale changes. And this is usually more appropriate in the short term and sort of with sites that are experiencing maybe lower intensity impacts. And then with resilience, we kind of recognize that we can't really prevent change from happening, but we can manage it in a way that helps our systems bounce back in response to disturbances and sort of embraces and rolls with a certain level of change. And then with transition, we're accepting and acknowledging that change might be so great that our system's identity might just transform as we work toward adapting an ecosystem to completely novel conditions. So, this is a spectrum. You might find that you fall somewhere between, resistance and resilience, or between resilience and transition. But we just encourage you, as you explore and develop your adaptation actions, to kind of frame things in terms of where you fall on this spectrum, because that can be really helpful. And then this is the video that we're asking everyone to watch to just kind of go a little bit deeper into those concepts and also go over some of the tools we're going to use in this step. So the video helps to kind of set the context and rationale for step 4. And the link to the video is in the course syllabus and is also built into the adaptation workbook, but we'll share that in the email newsletter as well. And then this is, just to kind of zoom out, these broad adaptation options are, of course, part of the logical train of thought we've been progressing on throughout this process. So really, this diagram is just a nice way of kind of visualizing the intentionality that everyone has gone through into getting to this point of identifying adaptation actions, starting with developing our management goals and objectives, and then looking at those climate change vulnerabilities and identifying our challenges and opportunities. And this pie chart is kind of just this is developed, from just years of NIACS working with different groups and finding that, most of the projects they've worked with have featured sort of just like management actions that are sort of business as usual with little tweaks. And then, you have the more resilience and transition approaches in the dark blue and orange, where you might be, making just some small tweaks that accommodate for some change, or really pushing some existing boundaries and taking more of a transition approach and trying really new and different actions. So let's talk about what the actual process of completing step 4 in the workbook is like. So the first thing that you'll do in the workbook is choose an adaptation menu. So we really do encourage you to first kind of explore those menus using that link, and then you'll pick and choose them in the workbook. And each menu will typically include somewhere around 10 strategies. And then those strategies will feature different approaches, which are a bit more specific. So you'll kind of have a drop-down arrow to choose which menu you're working with and then select an approach. And then you'll build off of that to write your own specific adaptation tactic, which will include all those details of what you want to do. So that's the what, the when, the where, the who. And I think, in terms of getting into the tactic, it's really helpful to think about if you were going to have a crew or maybe group of volunteers be helping you out with something. The tactic is really what those specific details they are that they would need to carry out the work. So for example, you might have an approach of generally reducing competition for resources like moisture and nutrients, maybe in the context of trying to establish certain other species. And in that case, one of your tactics might be to, remove invasive strawberry guava in this section, and then to clear and mulch the site after removal. So really specific in those tactics. And then next, you'll want to identify the time frame for your actions, which there are a few ways to go about. You might have a very specific season or even a month that you want to do something. Or maybe your tactic is very dependent on another management action happening, or maybe something in response to a specific disturbance, in which case you might do like the third bullet, within 3 years of X, we will do this. So really, this is a pretty flexible section. We want the timeframes to serve you, so you can be as prescriptive or unprescriptive as you'd like. And then next, we want you to consider the benefits and drawbacks of each tactic. So first, just think about why the tactic is helpful, what compelled you to choose this tactic, and then think about, what kind of co-benefits the tactic might have and how likely it is to succeed. And then on the flip side, you're going to want to consider the ways in which your tactic might not work so well, or what kinds of barriers you might face. And this could range from maybe it potentially creates negative side effects in another area of your project, or maybe it's challenging in terms of financial and labor requirements, like some of you have brought up. And so really that exercise helps to set you up to better understand the practicability of your project. So here you'll want to consider both the effectiveness and feasibility of the tactic. And when you sort of mentally score it on those two scales, you can understand whether or not it's a practical tactic to undertake. So you might think, yes, this tactic will definitely be helpful and it's relatively easy for us to do, then great. But maybe there are some tactics where you're not quite sure maybe of how effective it will be. And there are also some major barriers, in which case you might want to consider it low practicability. So rating each tactic in this way will then finally take you to the point of ultimately whether or not you recommend or decide on pursuing the adaptation tactic. So the reason we do this in sort of a drawn out way is because we want you to just be able to brainstorm as many tactics as you can dream up originally without immediately ruling them out due to logistic obstacles or other things. So we want you to create this really full list of tactics, and then you can sort of organize them by which ones are the most low-hanging fruit. But then you'll also still have that record of those less feasible options that might end up being more useful or feasible at a future time. And so this is a really helpful process as well for some of you who might be seeking funding. And it's a good process for just demonstrating your decision-making process and showing that you considered multiple alternative paths of action. And then that's basically all I'll be sharing for step 4. So hopefully this is an exciting step for everyone. Usually you kind of have some good momentum by the time you get to this part in the workbook. And again, you'll have the video that we're sharing to reference as you work through step 4. So yeah, just let us know if you have any questions. And before I turn it over to Courtney, who's going to give an example from the Hakalau Forest National Wildlife Refuge, I'll just ask if there's any questions, if you want to either unmute or put them in the chat. Oh, that's good. The updated version of the homework video is only 18 minutes long, so got it under 20.
Awesome. Any questions for Maddie? I'm not seeing any come. Oh, there's one. Awesome. Thanks, Katie. Perfect. So now what I want to do is walk through just a case study example of how we can be thinking about this. And so this example really comes from this Hakalau Region Climate Informed Restoration Technical Resource document that was just published earlier this year. So thank you, Christian, for sharing it with me. And this process also was facilitated and led by EcoAdapt, and they have some awesome tools that really go through vulnerability assessments, climate impacts, and potential adaptation actions for the Hawaiian Islands. And so I would really encourage you to check those out. And they are at that link. So if you go to cakex.org, and then you can find resources for Hawaii and the Pacific Islands. So it's a really awesome resource, and I would definitely encourage you all to check that out. And so for the Hakalau Forest National Wildlife Refuge, it is on the windward slopes of Mauna Kea. And of course, it's an important habitat for native forest birds and plants, including several threatened and endangered species. And so it's been exposed to a variety of different pressures over time, including the clearing of large swaths of native forest for agriculture and livestock grazing, and as well as the intentional and accidental introduction of invasive plants and animals that have really degraded some of the habitats and outcompeted some of the native species. And so for a lot of this information, I again pulled it from this technical resource guide. And so if you'd like a copy, reach out to Christian. Hopefully he can send it around to folks. But these are some of the, starting with going through the adaptation workbook process like we've done so far, and really starting with that step 1, defining the area and the management goals and objectives. Here are some of the key management goals that I pulled from this document. So they're things like creating, restoring, and enhancing native terrestrial and aquatic habitats to really protect that biodiversity and provide wildlife habitat and ecosystem services, to manage the spread of invasive species and improve vector management to reduce the impacts of native species and people, to maintain or improve that watershed protection values, provide public access and engagement opportunities, promote wildfire prevention, suppression, and recovery to reduce the catastrophic risk of wildfire into the future, and then find opportunities to engage the broader community to really build consensus and support for some of those restoration and conservation activities, and then using that as an opportunity to cultivate and maintain partnerships to effectively coordinate those restoration outcomes, and of course engage in monitoring to make sure that they are effective moving forward into the future. So those are some examples of those goals to really set the starting point of how is this going to inform which climate change impacts we care the most about, and how are we going to influence those adaptation actions. And so again, the second step is to really think about what are those key climate change impacts. And so for this process, EcoAdapt used a scenario planning framework to really determine some of those key climate change impacts and vulnerabilities for Hakalau Forest. And scenario planning is really a process where you start to envision a bunch of plausible futures that might occur. So coming up with a bunch of multiple scenarios, and what will potential climate change impacts look like under those different scenarios, and how are they going to affect our management goals and priorities as we develop action moving forward into the future. So it's really a way to think about what the future could look like, compare how different resources might be affected, and then compare what management management actions could be taken. And so for this process, they looked at 4 different climate scenarios. So one, and out to the 2100 timeline. So really thinking about how are these going to play out over the next 100 years. And so some of those 4 climate scenarios were extreme variability and drought periods and intense rain events. The second was increased fire frequency and severity. The third was increased frequency and strength of tropical storms and hurricanes. And then the fourth was increased frequency of occurrence of those trade wind inversions and changes in their base height. And so based on those 4 different scenarios, these are some of the themes of climate change impacts that I pulled from this resource document. So those were things like increases in annual mean temperatures, especially at those higher elevations, increased risk of drought in those low and mid elevation leeward areas, more frequent tropical cyclones, especially during El Nino, and then less frequent during La Nina events, a reduction in annual snowfall, resulting in a near disappearance of snow on the summit of Mauna Kea, and then a decline in soil moisture, decreases in stream flow and water yield, and then increases in that wildfire probability. And so you can start to see how some of these impacts really are going to influence those different management goals that we saw on the previous slide. And so from there, the step that we've all been working on over the last couple of weeks is really evaluating our management goals and objectives, given those projected impacts and vulnerabilities. So starting to think about what are those challenges and opportunities for management. And so some of the challenges that were identified were that mosquito habitat is potentially expanding during those increased rainfall years or the La Nina years, with predominant expansions occurring in those windward locations and increases in mosquito habitat in those leeward locations as well. And then another challenge was that by 2100, the species richness is expected to decline, with 90% of modeled bird species likely losing over 75% of their current range because of those increased temperatures and the risk of avian malaria. However, there were some opportunities identified as well. So those are things like some native biomes are expected to have increased distribution under climate change, such as dry shrublands and dry forests. There's also priority sites for restoration that can provide some of those habitat corridors for many different bird species to use. And there's the potential to maybe harvest some of those invasive species like strawberry guava for biochar in areas with those drier soils. So those are some of the potential opportunities based on those climate change impacts that are presented for management into the future. And so based on all of that information, there were a spectrum of adaptation options and actions that were identified in this report. And so what I've done is kind of chunked them into a couple examples of what this can look like for resistance versus resilience versus transition. And so the approaches are really pulled again from those NIACS adaptation menus of strategies and approaches. And then those tactics are the specific actions that are specific to Hakalau Forest, and those prescriptive actions of what can be done and implemented on the ground. And so, for example, one of the approaches for resistance might be to prioritize and maintain sensitive or at-risk species or communities. And so an example tactic might be to really preserve sites for birds that are starting to develop that resistance or tolerance to that avian malaria. So again, really trying to maintain what's currently in the ecosystem that you value as that option for resistance. And then for resilience, an example approach might be to favor or restore native species that are expected to be adapted to those future conditions. And so maybe there's an opportunity to partner with neighbors to really increase that connectivity from Macau to Mackay and really think about how can we be favoring and restoring those native species that are adapted to those future conditions across that gradient. And then finally, for transition, an approach might be to introduce new species that are expected to be adapted to future conditions. And so there might be the opportunity to transplant or introduce species that haven't historically been present, but might be better adapted to those future conditions as one of those prescriptive tactics. And there's definitely challenges with the neonative species that are already present, but especially as we're thinking as temperatures increase and precipitation changes, and we have this decrease in snowfall, and species are starting to migrate upslope, maybe there's an opportunity to expand the population ranges of some of those species upslope as well, so that we still have those ecosystems we want to see into the future. And then another tactic might be to learn to live with some of those invasive species. So those are some different examples of some of those different tactics or actions that were identified in this report, and how they might fall across that resistance, resilience, or transition gradient. And then, of course, the last step is to really monitor the effectiveness of your actions into the future. And so you can do this by tracking performance metrics and management triggers associated with some of your restoration targets, or maybe testing a mix of different species and seeing which ones perform well into the future, or of course, tracking the birds and seeing where they're going and what habitat they're really thriving in, and that sort of thing. So those are some examples of monitoring identified in the Hakalau Forest Technical Guide as well. And so with that, I'm going to pause and see if there are any questions, and then we're just going to wrap it up with some pro tips for working in the adaptation workbook. And feel free to unmute yourself if you do have a question.
I think what stood out to me the most in the last slide was the learn to live with blackberry, and I guess I'm curious what everyone thinks about that. Maybe there's some battles we can't win and some things we need to not put energy into if it's not going to be productive.
That's a great comment, Elliot. And I think that's why personally, I really like this spectrum of thinking about adaptation from maintaining what's there to transitioning to something that we're intentionally facilitating that change for into the future, as long as it still meets our management goals and objectives. And so I think that's definitely something that's up for debate, but a great suggestion and idea of something that might push the boundaries a little bit, and might be something that's a wild and crazy idea, but also an option of something we could be thinking about as an adaptation tactic or action. But I would be curious if others have thoughts about that as well. And Christian is also putting a ton of awesome resources into the chat. So I would encourage you to make sure you get a copy of those links as well. And we can try to provide some of those with the newsletter that we send out later. Any other comments or questions before I move on? Cool. I'm not seeing any, but feel free to type them into the chat box as we keep going. And Elliot brought up a great point for discussion, and hopefully we can continue those over the next couple of weeks, and especially next week when we start discussing some of the adaptation approaches and actions that you come up with for your projects as well. So I'm really looking forward to that discussion. All right, so this week, as you're working your way through the adaptation workbook and really thinking about step 4, here are just some pro tips to consider. So again, there's the menus that have been incorporated into the adaptation workbook tool, but we would, as Maddie said, encourage you to check out some of those other menus as well. You might be able to pull some different ideas of different approaches that might more closely pertain to some of your management goals and objectives. So those are definitely resources to think about. There's also example tactics if you interact with some of the different menus that you can look at to give you some ideas if you need to boost your creativity a little bit in your thinking. And then, of course, when you're choosing from those menus, you can always pick multiple strategies and approaches, and then you'll be able to add a tactic for each one within the adaptation workbook. And so you'll want to make sure that they're connected to your objectives. And so what you'll see is you'll have your management objectives in the adaptation workbook, and then you can add a specific strategy, approach, and tactic that relates to that management objective within that online tool. And then ultimately what you're going to want to do after you've gone through and really thought about those benefits and drawbacks and the practicability of your actions is to ultimately determine if you want to recommend that tactic for action and to implement it or not. And so that's really what this step in this process is going to help you do, is brainstorm a bunch of creative ideas for those adaptation actions, but then ultimately recommend what you want to move forward with in the near term and the long term. And so this is what this will look like within the adaptation workbook. You'll see you can find those menus with the adaptation strategies and approaches. So the forest, the urban menu, the agricultural, and the forested ecosystems. And then you'll see your goals and objectives. And then underneath that, there'll be a button that says add tactics. So you can click that. And then when you do, it'll pull up this box and you can choose to add some of those details, such as what are the specific actions you want to implement for this tactic? What are some of those barriers? What are the drawbacks? When are you going to implement it with that time frame? And then what's the practicability? And then make sure you hit save on that box as well, so that all of those details are saved in the adaptation workbook. And then also you'll see the option to recommend or not recommend. And so you'll want to click the one that you choose ultimately. And then if you choose to not recommend that action, there's a space for you to include why. So maybe this is where you put in, there's just too many political considerations, or we don't have the capacity to implement this at this time, or we need to find more funding opportunities to actually be able to do this action in the future. And so that's where you can put some of that information as well. Awesome. And then again, there's the videos within the adaptation workbook that'll give you more details about this step. We'll send out the link to the video that goes into more detail about resistance, resilience, and transition. And that gives some examples of different actions that can be considered resistance, resilience, and transition as well. So those are things to look out for in the newsletter. And so between now and the next time we meet, some of the things to do are to catch up on steps 1 through 3 as needed. And then again, watch that presentation on those adaptation concepts, resistance, resilience, and transition. Complete step 4 within the adaptation workbook, which is identifying those adaptation actions. And then there's again a short homework section after step 4 that's going to ask you a couple questions about how you feel about adaptation at this point in the process. And then if you're interested, there is a video that was recorded either yesterday or earlier this morning, Maddie, I can't remember, that one of our colleagues did, that is a brief tour of the NIACS climate adaptation menus of strategies and approaches. And so if you really want to learn more about all of the different menus and what goes into creating a menu, that's a great video to check out. And so we'll send that link around as well, just as an additional tool. And then of course, all of this information is in the course syllabus and within the adaptation workbook itself. And you can find the longer presentation on adaptation concepts there, as well as the menus of strategies and approaches and some adaptation links to those adaptation demonstrations of other examples of projects that have really thought about these concepts of resistance, resilience, and transition and how to implement them for their projects to meet their management goals and objectives. And so with that, our next lecture is going to be next Tuesday, March 2nd. We are going to start out with that discussion on your adaptation actions that you work on this week. So please come prepared with some ideas of potential adaptation actions that you're starting to think about for your projects. And then we'll end the session with a presentation on monitoring and evaluating effectiveness. And so with that, that's all we've got for this week. So again, mahalo so much for your time. Thank you, everyone. And if you have questions, we'll stick around for a couple of minutes to answer any questions that you might have. But thanks again, everyone, for your time and for the great discussion session today.